I've been growing vegetables in this polytunnel for about 8 seasons, and it forms one of 7 family-scale gardens that makes up a major part of this Red Gardens project. I've found it to be a great space for growing the heat-loving summer crops, which would otherwise be very difficult to grow in the maritime climate of Ireland. I've also been exploring the possibilities of growing in this covered space all year round. Over that time, I've come to believe that perhaps the most valuable use of a polytunnel space in this climate is to grow crops for harvesting in late spring and even into early summer, when not much is available from the outside gardens yet, to fill what is commonly referred to as the hunger gap. Although it can be a bit difficult to find a balance between getting the most out of this garden for each season, I've been learning a lot over the years and getting better at growing the spring crops. Looking back at the harvest so far, I'm really pleased with a lot of the spring crops this year, and some of the yield data is quite remarkable, I think. The main strategy within this garden is to be able to harvest vegetables all year round, which means planting types of crops that are not normally grown in a polytunnel. Broad beans or fava beans are a good example of this, and I really hesitated growing this crop, which seemed too low yielding for such a high value growing space, and they usually grow so well outside. But I was surprised that I was able to harvest over 30 kilograms of pods from this 4 square meter bed, which translates to 7.5 kilograms per square meter, but that is for the full pod. If I was to weigh only the broad bean seeds themselves, this would reduce the yield to about 2.5 kilograms per square meter, which is low enough. But on the other hand, to get 10 kilograms of broad bean seeds from a relatively small area of the garden is quite impressive. Garlic is also an unusual vegetable to grow in the polytunnel, but I've found that the bulbs can grow so much larger than they do outside, perhaps too big. Once the plants had dried and cured, the yield this season was almost 3 kilograms per square meter, which is less than most of the other vegetables I would grow. But to get 7.5 kilograms of garlic from a relatively small 2.5 square meter bed is a lot, and more than enough garlic for most people for a full year, so it's definitely worth growing. Onions are also a relatively unusual vegetable to grow in a polytunnel, especially the storage variety. But this season they were at the other end of the scale in terms of yield, with about 11 kilograms harvested from each square meter. It's also very useful to get a much earlier crop than is available outside, especially when some of them are harvested as green onions, as this helps to fill the gap in onion supplies between one year and the next. The root vegetables are usually really productive in the protection of the polytunnel in the spring, as they can grow so quickly. This was especially the case this season, where yields ranged from 15 kilograms per square meter for beets and only 7 kilograms per square meter for kohlrabi, which technically is more of a swollen stem than a root, but I include it anyway. The crop of turnip and carrots were in between the two, but with all these plants, the longer you leave them, the bigger they can grow, but the quality of the root can suffer as the size increases. This was my first season growing a particular hybrid variety of turnip, and it was definitely tastier when harvested smaller, and I've found the same to be true with kohlrabi. The beet and carrots, on the other hand, retained an acceptable quality as they grew larger, but it really depends on what you want and how much time is available before needing the space for other crops. Another important factor with all these crops is that the yield I calculated was for the full plant, including the stems and leaves. And if I was just weighing the roots, then the yields would be lower, but still quite good. We tend to eat all the stems and leaves of the beet plants, and have been pleasantly surprised by the quality and taste of the turnip leaves. But we don't eat kohlrabi leaves, and only occasionally eat some of the carrot leaves. More than many of the other types of vegetables, the harvestable yield really depends on what you want from these root crops. The leafy salad greens are also great crops for growing in the spring in the polytunnel. I've been exploring a number of different methods for growing a range of different types, and I typically get around 5 kilograms per square meter out of these salad type crops, which is really more than it sounds, as 1 kilogram is a lot of salad leaves. They can produce over a reasonably long period of time, but a lot depends on the weather and how well I manage these crops, as they all have a tendency to bolt or to start the process of producing seeds. One related crop that I have been quite surprised with this season is a variety of kale that I've been growing and harvesting as a type of salad crop, and this one bed produced more than 10 kilograms per square meter of small and medium-sized leaves. The plants seem very resistant to bolting, and I only pulled them up to make space for the next crop, and I wonder how long these plants would have continued to produce fresh kale leaves. Potatoes are another crop that grow really well outside, but with the threat of late frosts, I find that I can produce a much earlier crop of potatoes by growing them under cover. This season I tried growing 6 different varieties of early potatoes, which I harvested over a 5-week period of time, and the average yield was about 6 kilograms per square meter, or about 1 kilogram per plant. This is a lower yield than lots of other crops that I could grow over the same period of time, but this is calculated or evaluated on a kilogram or weight basis, which is perhaps a bit unfair, as potatoes are generally seen as a carbohydrate or calorific crop. It would be interesting to calculate the harvested yield in terms of calories per square meter, as I imagine the potatoes would come out much higher than most of the other crops that I'm growing. The spring crop of broccoli seemed to be quite good this year, but only produced 4.4 kilograms of large central heads and a few secondary side shoots. The plants probably could have produced more side shoots, but I was anxious to remove this crop so that I could get the eggplant or aubergine plants transplanted into the bed instead. While most other crops can be harvested earlier, with this type of crop you have to wait until the edible flower head is produced before you can harvest anything. Because I have to delay the subsequent crop, and with not great yields, I do wonder if it is worth growing this type of crop at all. The adjacent cauliflower crop was quite different though, and I was surprised that it had almost double the yield of the broccoli plants, with more than 8 kilograms per square meter of edible central heads harvested at the same period of time. And the quality of the crop was really good. This was my first year growing microgreens in the soil beds of the Polytunnel, and I was pleasantly surprised how productive this very quick crop can be. Some of the better batches produced in the region of 2.5 kilograms of high-value mixed microgreens from each square meter of bed within 3 or 4 weeks of sowing. And as the temperature warmed as the spring progressed, the length of time between sowing and harvesting dramatically decreased. I had a few pest issues which reduced the yield and took some time to figure out how to avoid. And I also had significantly overestimated the amount of time that I would need between batches on the same section of soil. Overall, I was able to harvest a bit more than 4 kilograms per square meter from this first trial on one section of the garden before I needed the bed for the cucumber crop. And this is a lot of microgreens. But I have calculated that I might have been able to harvest as much as 10 kilograms per square meter from a quicker succession of sowings before the bed was needed for the summer crop. And it will be interesting to see if I can get this type of yield next season. This was quite a wide range of crops, with different availability for when they were harvested and different lengths of time between sowing and harvesting. There was also a wide range of yields, but I'm not really comparing like for like in some cases, as a kilogram of one crop is not really the same as a kilogram of the other, both in terms of the nutrition that you can get out of it and often quite different in terms of personal preference. But I think all of these crops were quite successful, and it was really nice to get the diversity. The hybrid variety of turnip that I grew definitely produced the highest yield in the shortest period of time, as well as doing better in the cooler part of the spring, and I was quite impressed with the growth and the taste of this crop. But it was the beets that produced the highest overall yield, even if these plants did occupy the garden bed for a longer period of time, and it is one of my favorite vegetables. The 15 kilograms per square meter of beetroots and greens that I was able to harvest is a lot of food to get out of a garden, especially when there's still lots of time in the season to grow another crop or even two in the same section of garden bed. I have a general target of wanting to harvest at least 1,000 kilograms or more than a ton of a diverse range of vegetables from this garden over the full 2019 season, and a comparable target of wanting to harvest at least 500 kilograms from each of the outside gardens. While each of these gardens covers a total area of 100 square meters, there's only about 67 square meters of growing beds in this polytunnel garden, once you exclude the paths. So, to hit this target of 1,000 kilograms, I would need to harvest on average about 15 kilograms of vegetables from each square meter of bed over the full season. And with the beet crop, I reached the target with just one crop in only part of the season. The crops of kale, onions, turnip, cauliflower, and carrots all produce more than half of this target, and the broad beans did as well, but only if I include the pods. In total, I've already harvested over 500 kilograms from this garden, including all of these spring crops and a few overwintering crops, which is more than half of the target for this garden. 500 kilograms already matches what I want to be able to harvest out of each of the outside gardens, and this shows the real benefit of growing under the protection of polytunnel plastic. It's been a good start to the season so far for this garden, and there's still a lot more to harvest over the summer, autumn, and into the winter. I think it's useful to ask why the yields in this polytunnel garden have been so good for the first half of this season, even better than in previous years. The weather has been quite good, with generally warmer than average conditions over the winter, and then a relatively cool spring, and it didn't get hot until the end of June, and this was perhaps the biggest factor. The protection of the polytunnel plastic in these conditions would generally have boosted the temperature into a range that provided good growing conditions for most of these crops, without it getting so hot that the plants became stressed. In addition, the levels of fertility and the soil quality in this garden have gradually improved, and I think that all of the work that I've put into building the soil is really paying off this season. While there was some disease and pest pressure, it wasn't generally enough to reduce yields, except with the microgreens. And this was helped with a new sprinkler system that I installed, which has made it a lot easier to maintain good soil moisture levels. Different crops and better varieties have also contributed to this increase in yield, and I'm getting better at managing a lot of these crops. This involves knowing when to sow and how to care for the different types of plants, and when to harvest so that I can get large yield of good quality crops, and also how to keep the garden relatively clear of weeds. I still have some work to do in developing the skills and knowledge that are needed, but I feel that I'm definitely becoming more successful in managing the particulars of this garden through the spring and into the summer. And a lot of this comes down to planning and doing what needs to be done when it's the best time to do it. This polytunnel garden is one of 7 family-scale gardens that I'm experimenting with, that together with the larger black plot that I'm developing form what I call the Red Gardens Project. This is an independent, citizen-led research and development project focused on trying to encourage and support other people to grow more of their own food. The only external funding that this project receives is through the sale of surplus vegetables to my neighbors, by people like you watching my videos, and through direct donations and contributions through my Patreon and PayPal accounts. I'd really like to thank those people who have decided to make regular contributions to my project through my Patreon account or once-off donations through PayPal. If you'd like to join them, any contributions would be greatly appreciated, and I've left links to these in the description below. But most importantly, thank you for watching.